Welcome to the talk. This is Building Universe in a Bottle, the Tools of Outer Wilds. While making this, I realized this should have been a 50-minute talk, not a 30, so I'm going to go a little fast. I didn't know there would be live translation, so I just want to say I am so sorry, translators. This is going to move faster than it should. What is this talk about? Tools were one of the big successes of the development of Outer Wilds. They allowed us to build something far bigger and with far more polish than we could have with such a small team. The focuses of this talk are going to be the tools and methods we use to build spaces in Outer Wilds, the way those tools allowed for rapid and low-cost iteration, and then on the back end, miscellaneous, unique, and odd tools that ended up being important were just sort of interesting to look at. So first of all, who am I? I'm Logan. There's no time for more than that. I was hired in 2015 as a technical artist at MOBIUS Digital. Since then, I've done physics code, gameplay code, rendering, tools. It's a small team. You end up doing whatever needs to get done, right? A little bit of a project background. So Outer Wilds is an open world space mystery set in a miniaturized solar system. Every planet is a rigid body that's careening through space in dynamic orbit around the sun. Truth in the simulation was important to the project, as players needed to be able to form and test hypotheses to get results that held up under scrutiny. We had a playtesting-centric approach. Solving design challenges was dependent on getting data. We had lots of level design challenges, so we needed to rapidly iterate and rearrange spaces. We wanted not to get locked in by our production pipeline. This is something that happens pretty commonly late in development. You know what the better version of something should be, but the tools and pipeline block you from making it, leaving you stuck with the worst version. I didn't want to end up there. We had a small team. We are 11 people right now. We were maybe about 15 at the peak of Outer Wilds production with some external contractors beyond that. So people needed to be spending their time on the important questions and decisions and not busy work. And we were also building off of existing alpha geometry. There was an alpha of Outer Wilds that won IGF in 2015. The level design method for that was established as sort of jamming out geometry in Maya, and so we needed to be able to work off of that and respond to changes at that level. Performance findings. So this is important for later context, why we made the decisions we did. So repeated tests of Unity, every time there was a major version upgrade, we found that for Outer Wilds, the most important factor in CPU time was the number of colliders we had in the scene. And we found that merging many mesh colliders into a single complex mesh collider gave dramatic performance returns. On the rendering side, 2015, draw calls were still a major bottleneck, and merging meshes also solved that. And back then, mesh memory was cheap enough to be considered a good trade-off. Without further ado, let's walk through the process of building out a space in Outer Wilds and the tools that help us do it. So the level design process was, like I mentioned, heavily defined by the alpha version of Outer Wilds. Designers would quickly build out areas in Maya, apply a quick UV and material pass. It gave it sort of an N64 look, very charming. And it would have very fast turnaround time on level design changes. And it was generally immediately playable as soon as you dropped it into Unity. Alex Beecham created a small set of tools in Maya to make level design on spheres easier. The origin distance tool created and controlled a live sphere surface in Maya dynamically. And that basically let you use the quad draw tool to easily draw on the surface of the sphere. You were able to configure presets for different elevations. You were able to move vertices between levels. It made what would have been just a miserable task of trying to level design on a sphere in Maya into a slightly less one. So how do we get from that to final game geometry? So after the art reboot, we ended up two styles of world construction: kit bashing and the Coulson method. Let's start by looking at kit bashing. So here's a gray box for the impact crater on Timber Hearth. And here's what it looks like after a kit bashing pass by our art director, Wesley Martin. What we're seeing here is about 100 individual game objects, each with their own mesh renderer and mesh collider. And if you remember the performance finding slide from 51 seconds ago, this is not going to fly. So early on, I created a tool called Mesh Batch to take a bunch of objects in the scene that share materials and merge them into a single mesh. We also did this process for the colliders. This helped dramatically with the CPU load and helped dramatically with the draw count, call count as well. It was a script that was attached to the group's parent in the scene, and it batched everything below it with a few options you can see there. It was always left unbaked in saved scenes. Baked being, it's been processed, joined into a new one. And when you bake it, it still leaves the originals in the scene, but hidden until build time, at which point it throws them out. During build time, it would auto-bake all of them and hide the originals, leaving the originals intact. You never lose that data. But we always left it unbaked. And we ended up using this all over the game to merge props, detail objects, and most importantly, our NOMI structure building kits. So, hey, apply that here. We've solved the optimization issue. The kit assets look good individually. They're arranged nicely, but this still doesn't look great. Why? So to me, big things to pop out is there's no grounding in the world. There's no material or lighting interactions with the surrounding geometry. And there's no geological scale interest. So there's no material changes over the scale of the whole cliff. It's just very flat. It's a flat color wash. So it also wastes a huge amount of internal geometry. So there's all these internal triangles, and because it's a cliff, it has all these back-facing triangles. Super wasteful. I decided to make a tool to try to solve the wasted geometry problem. Fewer triangles mean we can merge more things into a single mesh, which means better performance, right? I experimented with Boolean merges of exported geo in Maya, and it crashed every single time. Thanks, Maya. So I started building a tool in Unity to do a clean Boolean merge of kit-bashed objects. Writing a solver for a clean Boolean merge ended up being more trouble than I hoped, and it was looking to be like a week or two to actually make the good version. And then a couple days into that, I realized I didn't have to solve the hard problem. I don't need a clean Boolean merge. I just need to throw out the triangles the player couldn't see, which is a much easier problem. This sort of ended up being a guiding principle for me on working on Outer Wilds, where you take what seems to be a very hard problem and you start chopping off the parts you don't actually need to do, and eventually you're left with a much more solvable problem. So this tool would check if a triangle was contained inside the arrangement of meshes and throw it out if so. And I also added a feature to plug a subtractive mesh in, which would throw out any triangles it contained, which we used that to cut away the backsides of cliffs or any sort of geo that protruded into something that wasn't part of the baked geometry. Here's the result of the reduction. Wow, look how much cleaner that is. The result was actually better than I anticipated. It's an 80% reduction in vertex count for cliffs and a 66% reduction for islands. That actually beats out the results of a clean Boolean merge because it turns out those add geometry to make the merge clean. The bake time in Unity was 5 or 10 minutes, pretty quick. And we saved this result out to the project as a new mesh, but again, left the originals disabled in the scene so that it was easy to go back and edit them. I also saw an opportunity during the stage to add detail and data for almost free. I created a set of custom UV projectors in Unity that the terrain baker could hook into, and it came in flavors such as planar, cylindrical, conical, wedgical. The terrain baker could also bake custom vertex color into the final mesh, which we used to embed things like large-scale ambient occlusion. And you can take a look at those parameters and see how that UV unwrap might give you a good set of UVs for the entire crater. So here's the result of that extra detail. You can see the difference that a unified color gradient makes. That comes from the detail texture using a custom UV set we projected into it. We also have another tool to bake large-scale ambient occlusion into the mesh, and we'll get to that tool later. I think this is a big improvement, and this is actually what we ended up shipping. If you look at the floors, oh, that's darker than I'd like, but you can see most of it. If you look at the floors, those aren't any special tool. We just hand-made those. They were hand-authored to match the results of the kit-bashed geo. It wasn't great, it was a sort of elbow grease solution, but it never became a bottleneck for reduction to my knowledge, so we never ended up with a better solution there. So now let's talk about the other major way we made environment geo in Outer Wilds. Kit bashing works well for some types of environments, but is traditionally a nightmare to work with when it comes to caves and thin walls. And no matter how good your kit is, it ends up bulging out where you don't want it to, or leaving crevices for players to get distracted by, or worse, stuck in. We have one planet in our solar system, Ember Twin, that is literally all canyons and tunnels and very tightly packed caves. Just look at it. Look at those caves under the surface. Imagine having a kit bash that. Oh no. We needed a new approach, and MOBIUS artist Lara Coulson led the charge on this one. So for the purpose of embarrassing my coworker, we're going to refer to this as the Coulson method. It's a workflow that bases the final geometry directly off the designer-created gray box. So step one is the gray box geo is loaded into Maya and cleaned up. Specifically, that means converting it to use quads with a clean edge flow. And then from there, it's unwrapped in a tool called UV layout, giving it a set of UVs for world scale tiling displacement maps. Because the mesh is low poly and now it has clean quads, unwrapping it isn't as bad as it sounds, and UV layout is a pretty good tool. So then we move the mesh into ZBrush, and we tessellate it, we smooth it, with care taking on smoothing certain edges. And then we apply a tiling displacement map in ZBrush, creating geological scale detail. We use Substance Designer to create these displacement maps. The displaced mesh is then reduced in poly count to a level which is game friendly and matches our aesthetic. So here's a before and after of the Coulson method. So this is, for reference, the south pole of Ember Twin. And you can see how closely it matches the gray box geo while also adding all this plausible geological detail. It does a great job at retaining the delicate design of sight lines, jumps, and compact spaces, and it's a pretty fast process to boot. And the use of a common displacement texture for like a type of terrain or a whole planet results in the same visual appearance of the terrain no matter which artist worked on it. The process of adding world scale UVs also adds opportunity for materials to use that same UV set for geological scale gradients or interest. You can see there's striation in the texture in there, and that's from that UV set, just a detailed texture plugged in. And then the mesh origin was usually placed at the planet's center, which allows for shader-based elevation level changes. So you can see the albedo down below is much darker, and it gets lighter and more pale as it goes up. And this makes it far more interesting visually at a distance to look at these miniature planets. And then when you're in there, it means the different elevations you're at all have a sort of different vibe. So that's terrain creation out of the way. But that's obviously only part of the process. So let's take a look at some of the tools we use to detail those spaces. So this is a big game to detail. Like I said, it's a whole miniaturized solar system. We had a strategy we developed early on to cluster detail around places only where there's narrative to discover. This helped focus player attention where we wanted it, and it also made the scale of detailing the solar system way more manageable. But we still needed to cut out as much busy work as possible from detailing, and we needed level design adjustments to not require us to redo an entire art pass. So, transform, stick, and align tools. We would use this to place larger objects, trees, stumps, anything that has a collider, some object to interact with. This honestly might be our most important tool. Back in the day when we were still figuring out the new art style, I saw Wesley, our art director, painstakingly placing ferns one by one in the Timberhearth village, which if you know the village, it is on the equator, which means it's sideways in the scene, facing out. So we'd like drag in a fern prefab, and it would show up completely at the wrong orientation, and he'd rotate it, and he'd rotate it, and he'd rotate it, and he'd rotate it, and then he'd like squish it down to the ground. That was too much, and he'd raise it out, and he'd try to scale it, and then he'd rotate it again. It was agonizing. It was very hard to watch. And also there's curvature over the whole, village, so you can't even have like a common sort of like orientation. So I implemented the stick and align tools to make the transform tool do what we actually intended it to do when we drag stuff in. So stick, it sticks to surfaces. Align aligns to the local gravity, or the surface normal, or the radius of the planet, depending on the setting. This saved an immeasurable amount of time over the course of the project. And I just think the basic operations you perform day to day should be the smoothest and most expressive. This was such an important tool. We bound it to A for line and S for stick, and if you're a gamer, you know how important those keys are. We ended up building prop pivots around what would work nicely for this tool, in fact. That's how important it ended up being. We still have a lot of detail objects to add, though. So I knew we needed to scatter small plants across an environment. And like I said, seeing artists do this by hand was very painful. I wanted a solution where they could stamp sort of pre-authored arrangements of detail objects around, but I also wanted them to be able to go in and slap one of the scene with speed, but also go in and tweak placement scale of the individual elements as much as they had time for. I didn't want to sacrifice the small scale detail for the large scale speed. And I also needed that work to not get thrown entirely away if the area changed. So I developed a detail patch tool, which is made of two parts: a detail palette asset, which is an assortment of meshes to use and parameters for the randomization, and then a detail patch scene object, which the palette plugs into. The detail patch scene object projects detail objects into the world with a raycast from this upper plane, and it aligns them with the hit surface based on the alignment settings in the palette. It can start with a randomized arrangement of elements from the palette, or start with pre-made arrangement if you like it. You could just make a prefab or save it out in some other way. It was extremely fast at getting an acceptable arrangement of detail objects in the scene, but it was also easy to add and edit individual elements and get the arrangement exactly how you want it. It was almost always left unbaked and then all baked during the build process, which meant that going into the scene and tweaking one was almost zero cost. It's just like moving any sort of tiny object. The results were great. You know, artists enjoyed using it, which is always like super flattering. It ended up being used for more than just plants. We used it for pottery shards, ghost metacrystals, debris. It not only prevented blocking late area revisions, but enabled first passes on areas sooner without having to throw out that work later, because you can just scoot the patches around. An interesting side note is that Heart Machine seems like they've taken this same idea to a larger scale for Hyper Lightbreaker. You can see them using a similar method to place entire city blocks in their environment in a no-clip documentary. So if this is interesting to you, go check that out, because that's like even beyond this. Vertex painting. We wanted to be able to use in-editor painting tools to paint material layers on the terrain. Super common game development requirement. This was a tool created years back by Jason Booth. It just put it online for free. It was the only third-party scene editing tool we used on Outer Wilds, and as its code stayed the same and we rolled through versions of Unity, it became increasingly cursed. But it did its job well enough that I never had to like go back in and like make a new one from scratch. But it also had an unexpected winning feature, which was an ambient occlusion baker. It ran pretty quickly, 1 to 5 minutes for a result for a large piece of terrain. We would store this data in the alpha channel of the mesh's vertex color, and our shaders all had a checkbox to look for and apply that. And if we were doing a terrain bake, we would frequently run this beforehand so that it ended up automatically embedded in the final mesh. We ended up using it to bake large-scale ambient occlusion into vertex color alpha for terrain, structures, large unique meshes. It did a tremendous amount to make things feel grounded in the world. It's the only form of light baking we have in the game. So decals, I thought mesh-based decals would be useful for detailing the world, so I got ahead of myself, made a whole tool for it, quick and easy, placement and baking. We ended up using that for other purposes than I thought we would. We ended up using it for design purposes like murals and signposting, more so than we ended up using it for placing details around the world like these burn marks. I made a guess about what we needed that ended up being slightly wrong, and I should have investigated our need more before running off to the woods on this one. So that's like a classic sort of tool development story. So here's the results of the detail pass. Here's the impact crater from earlier. We built this with kit bashing. And here's what it looks like after the detail pass. Wow, that's a video game. Here's the South Pole of Embertwin from earlier that we built with the Coulson method. And here's what it looks like after detailing. It looks more sparse, but remember, we put the detail where we want players to go, which in this case is the top of that rock formation. It's also a desert planet, so it sort of makes sense. All right, so that's fine, and there's nothing super mind-blowing in there, but here's where it all came together in a way that enabled us to iterate on level design in a really great way. Let's take a look at what it would take to get a space in Outer Wilds back into shippable state after an important level design change. So here's our impact crater. Once again, kit bashing. These are the steps you'd have to do to revise it and then get it back into shippable state. So you disable the baked terrain in the scene, you re-enable the originals. They're still in there. You edit the originals to your heart's content. You know, maybe you want to move that notch in the upper part over. Maybe you want to add stepping stones out. Maybe you want to pull some aside to allow for a new cave. Easy peasy, just moving objects around in Unity. If you feel like your changes warrant a new AO bake, 5 to 10 minutes to do that in editor. Then you go back to the terrain baker script in the scene. You click bake, 5 minutes, 10 minutes most. And then if you need to touch up any of the floor surfaces, that's a pain. You have to take it out, do a little bit of vertex movement, you know, put it back in. Fun fact, brittle hollow, we ended up putting all the floor surfaces in the kit bash, and so this is really only a timber hearth problem. Brittle hollow omits that stage entirely, largely. And then you disable the originals and re-enable the baked terrain in scene, and you're done. So this is a few hours of someone's time, and it could potentially even be just the designer's time, not even have to involve an artist. That's a fast enough turnaround to make the answer to the question, hey, should we change something here to make it a little better? An easy yes. Here's the South Pole of Ember Twin again, made with the Coulson process. Here's what needs to happen to get it back into shippable state if a designer requests a change. So you run it through the displacement process again, 1 to 3 hours, you know, that whole step there. Rebake AO if necessary in Unity, you're done. This is potentially slightly longer than the kit bashing method, and it requires an artist to have a few hours free. But it's still cheap enough that we can squeeze it into someone's schedule if we sit down and agree that it's important enough to. So we still need to fix all the details up, right? So the detail patches were created with a tool design goal of making these sorts of area revisions way less of a pain. Easy peasy, lemon squeezy. You move them into the new position, you revise any stray details. Great, love it, it works as intended. But vertex painting, no, that's hard, lemon hard. You have to like export the painted mesh to like Maya and then use transfer vertex attributes, you know, which is always fussy, and then move it back into Unity, the new version, and then if you need to go in and touch any painting, you know, it's, okay. In retrospect, I wish I had made my own in-Unity tool to transfer vertex color from one mesh to another. But the situation just didn't happen enough to justify it, but it absolutely added friction for level design revisions, for sure. Get to the point, Logan. My point is that the tools that supported level design changes during production and post-production were critical to shipping Outer Wilds in polish and visual and design polish it did. We largely avoided ever getting locked into anything because of our workflow and tools, which is a big accomplishment. Lessons learned, you want to keep the bake time low, about as much time as it takes to make a cup of tea. You want to keep the original assets around and easily editable, because a situation that happens late in development is you can go back and do it, but those original assets have been lost and you're just screwed, right? And if you can keep the entire process in a single editor, preferably the game editor, that hugely reduces the amount of friction to making those sort of revisions. Okay, but maybe you didn't show up to this talk to see like sort of garden variety tools that happen to come together well. Maybe you came to see the weird stuff that got made for Outer Wilds oddities. So yeah, let's take a look at some of the more kinky shit. So this is the Know My Text Arc editor. We had a bunch of branching text conversations in Outer Wilds for the player to read. And we had decided to portray them like you see in this screenshot, sort of a branching structure. We needed a way to generate a unique one of these for each conversation with different branching and lengths and sometimes different handwriting. And we wanted to be able to hand author these to some degree to inject personality. But we had hundreds of these conversations. So I built a little editor window. It was capable of importing the conversation text file and auto-generating some parameters for the curves like length, you know, that sort of stuff based off the sentence. The arcs are arranged in the editor, ready to go when you import it. You don't have to like click in, drag them in. They're just ready to be placed. Reference points are sort of built in, so you know they'll align well with the world surface, the whiteboard. You can see the little triangle there, the socket. The unique per conversation setup is able to be saved and loaded, so we don't lose work if revisions are needed. And you can export assets out, including a prefab that's just ready to be socketed and seen. This cut a ton of labor out, leaving just arc arrangement and sort of import-export jockeying. Our designer Logan Ver Hoef and artist Gus Lambrechtsen were able to power through all of these assets in 7 to 10 work days, which is a grind, but for that many assets, pretty good time. We were able to go back, edit, and cleanly re-export these with no scene modifications needed to see the result. So pretty good job at reducing all the busy work. So Skybox and Outer Wilds changes over time. We needed a way to author the arrangement of stars, the types and appearances of stars, and the rate of change. And one of our back rewards was also a constellation of your design in the game. So I built the star field editor. It was pretty all right for star placement. It resulted in good distribution of stars, and setting the distribution curves of the star death time, supernova amount, et cetera, was pretty easy. But only once, just the first time. I should have kept most stars sort of like virtual or mass tweakable, because at the end we wanted to change their destruction curve a little and couldn't easily do so. But we did end up using this tool to create our production logos in the title sequence, which I didn't anticipate, but that's the sign of a good tool when someone decides to use it for something you didn't expect. Let's see, there's an area in the Outer Wilds DLC that has an alternate representation of the space. We need to be able to swap some prefabs out en masse in the scene to build it out. And the replacement of these prefabs was sometimes part of a repeated workflow. So MOBIUS engineer Jeffrey Yu created this tool for our artist John Oppenheimer to not only facilitate the replacement, but to save sets of replacements to be repeatedly run and expanded over time. What we call Tron World was mostly built with this tool, and this tool removed 90% of the labor involved in that. And level design revisions could be turned around into a Tron World representation in about 1 to 3 hours of artist time, most of which was final tweaks. In Outer Wilds, the planet Brittle Hollow is bombarded by volcanic meteors from its moon Hollow's-Lantern. Meteors were one of the only random elements in the solar system, and we needed to verify distribution of the impacts across the surface was what we intended. Specifically, they needed to be even, but not too even, and we wanted the real data, not a simulation of it. So our director, Alex Beecham, made a tool to record impacts over the course of a loop. We left the game running for a couple of hours, data from several loops was gathered, tweaks applied, rerun data gathering, moved to longer samples as we got closer to the desired distribution. We found unintended patterns and where they landed, and we tweaked the rotation of the volcanic moon to break up those patterns, and we verified the fix of the tool. Great, wonderful. That's like exactly what we hoped this tool would do. We love being an evidence-based studio, and this tool sort of adhered to that philosophy, which is very cool. This one's boring. Early on, we developed a standardized hierarchy structure to separate by LOD and gameplay areas and type of object. But it's really important to remember that shared methodologies and grammars are tools too. And if you can all get on the same page early on, that does so much for a project. Later on, I added icons to the Unity hierarchy window to start to reveal aspects of the information, like baked, unbaked state of bakeable tools, sectors, that sort of thing. I could have gone way harder on that in retrospect, but I also made it so that selecting an object displays the names of the rendering and collision groups that control that object. And you can click on the name to jump to that group or LED gameplay area. It was incredibly useful over the course of the project to quickly understand connections and debug LOD issues. I was worried that'd be obnoxious or intrusive having that text pop up in the corner of the scene view, but apparently I got away with that one because nobody complained. Final tool, this one's goofy, but I love it. So classic game dev, we needed a way to prevent collisions, from people working on the same scene file or prefab at the same time. Super classic game development issue. We had started using Trello for task management at the same time when we had to solve this issue, and I decided to give this a shot. So you lock a file by dragging its card over to your column and release it by returning it or giving it to someone else. It was based on the totem system of file locking I had heard tales of, where someone had to hold a physical object, like an army man or a Pez dispenser, in order to work on its associated file. This is a version where someone can't accidentally take that home with them or go on vacation and forget to return it. It also works if someone's remote. This worked surprisingly well over the many years of Outer Wilds development. We had maybe one bad file collision a year, and it was always immediately clear who got to keep their work. It's the person with the lock on Trello. I personally love simple and flexible solutions like this, but maybe we only got away with this due to our small team size and very tight coordination. But that sort of leads me to my final point. Sometimes a simpler tool is a better tool, and often if you try to bring a tool closer to 100%, do everything you could possibly want it to do, that just makes it worse at everything. And ultimately, the way we solved a lot of problems in Outer Wilds is by narrowing in on only what we needed. Cut away, and also by cutting away all the menial stuff and letting the human sort of steer those interesting decision makings. So that makes a 90% tool, that last 10% is filled by a human being. So that's my final sort of thought there. And now is a great time for questions. There we go, now I can see you.
Hello. Thank you for the presentation. Sorry for my bad accent, but I have a question. At which point did you find that you needed a specific tool for a specific task? You presented some simple tools, but pretty complex and tools for grid tasks in scene management, etc. What was the process of finding these tools, that you needed these tools, and finding the time to develop it for your colleagues?
That's a great question. There's actually a slide I cut that was year by year the project history. 2015 was the FIG campaign and us having a one-year plan to ship it. 2016 is when we were signing a publishing deal with Annapurna and threw out the old thing and rediscovering our art style. 2017 and 2018 were realizing we needed to hit consoles and then getting it out the door. 2016, when we were working on signing the deal with Annapurna and also rebooting the art style, is where a lot of these tools got made. When we had the opportunity to restart from scratch, having already started once, which is a rare, opportunity in game development. That was the point at which we figured out kit bashing, we figured out the Coulson method, and then as these were being developed, I realized we had need for these tools, and I just, it's like, well, I'll take 3 days here, knock this out. I'll take 1 week there, knock that out. And there wasn't really anyone stopping me from just doing these, so, but yes, I would say that art reboot was responsible for a lot of the good tooling of Outer Wilds. It was a rare opportunity to have a second chance at the way we were building things. Thank you.
Hello. Thanks for the talk. Awesome talk, awesome tools. I have a question about the kit bashing merger. Since it happened at build time, how do you manage level of detail? Do you have LOD on individual mesh? Is there the merge mesh have LOD or not? How do you manage that?
How do you manage the level of detail on individual meshes?
Yes, since you merge all that, did they keep their level of detail, or did they?
Yes. Yeah, we don't lose. When you do the merge through the terrain baker or through the mesh batch, the result with no extra configuration should look visually identical. That was my goal. And so even if you've left it in the unbaked version, when you make a build, when it is automatically baked, it should be identical to what was in the editor. And it was one of those things where our art director, Wesley Martin, figured out really good ways to build and scale level of detail in these kits. We had rules for how big or small something could get. If we needed something that was a much larger piece or much smaller piece, we went and made a new one with the right level of detail to match the other assets. So just having like an art team that's on top of it. Anything added in by these baking things would be extra detail, but otherwise topologically identical.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
Thanks for the talk. I recall in the Noclip documentary that some level designers and programmers had issues with walking underneath the planets. When you have to walk on the other side of the planet, you have to switch your mind around and think in reverse. When I see all the tools that you've made here, I'm a bit shocked that you didn't do any tools for that. Is there a reason for this one?
That was something I considered talking about. Yeah, so we don't have any sort of special camera controls for Outer Wilds, but you know, when you're working on the bottom or side or like angled interior of a planet, you know, the camera just doesn't really know how to account for that because Unity and most game engines are built assuming you've got flat worlds. There were repeated times through development where I'm like, I could probably go in and add a custom camera control that aligned it to the local gravity to make it easier to work. But every time we got a new artist on the project or some new employee, within the first couple months, they had just learned to sort of do the mouse kickflip involved to move the camera the exact way they wanted it to be. Every time I considered that, you know, it's like, but they're all just like figuring it out and we're making it work. Maybe at the very beginning, I should have just done that anyway, but I think the human brain ended up being better at managing that situation than you would expect it to. And maybe my artists right now are screaming at me from across the planet. But yeah, it was absolutely something I considered several times, but in a couple months, almost everyone had just started working naturally without it. Very weird.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. Hello.
Oh, hello.
What method did you use to detect what polygons are supposed to be discarded? Because I assume not all meshes were closed meshes.
Yes. We made sure that all of our kit bashing pieces were watertight. This allowed me to load all the data in as one giant, you know, virtual sort of, here's all the meshes, you know, here's all vertex data. And then per vertex, I just do a ray cast out. And however, if I pass through an odd number of triangles, I am inside. If I pass through an even number, I am outside. Yes. Yeah, so that's a very common containment check for 3D stuff or even 2D stuff. For subtractive meshes, those would also require to be watertight, and you could just check, is this inside of this at all? There's actually some because I actually don't do a great job at checking, because I only check the 3 vertices, which means there are circumstances where part of the triangle is on the exterior, and all the vertices just happen to be contained, and that would get thrown out erroneously. But that is like, really showed up as only like a couple holes in terrain for the entire planet, and we would solve it generally by just putting a rock over it. So really not the most robust solution, but it was absolutely a workable, shippable one.
Merci, je pense qu'on arrive au terme de la conférence, donc ce sera tout pour les questions.